You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Westall. This week, we return to the topic of ufology and the eye-opening number of encounters that have occurred over schools and colleges around the world. Most of you will be aware of two of the most famous encounters, the Ariel School in Zimbabwe, which occurred in '94, and Westall in Australia, which happened back in 1966. But these are just the tip of the iceberg. Researcher, author, and investigator Preston Dennett joins me to discuss these cases from his book, Schoolyard UFO Encounters, from Florida to Kentucky, from Wales to France. Dozens of cases have been collected by Preston, and we discuss some of these incredible cases. It's a fascinating topic, and my thanks to Preston for joining me on this episode. But as always, before we get there, don't forget you can support Mysteries and Monsters by signing up for us via Patreon to support the show for $4 a month. You can find the link in this week's show notes as always, or go to patreon.com/mysteries and monsters. Mysteries and Monsters is also across all social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and you can subscribe to the Mysteries and Monsters YouTube channel as well. You can also now get Mysteries and Monsters merchandise by visiting mysteriesandmonsters.com and using the tabs on the top of the page. As always, artwork for the show is by Dean Bestall. The show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys, and Mysteries and Monsters is delighted to be a part of the Straight Up Strange network. So, time for us to return to the schoolyard. Only for us to realise it's not just the pupils and teachers that we'll find there. On this week's show, I am delighted to be joined by author, researcher and MUFON field investigator Preston Dennett. With a deep interest in ufology, the paranormal and more besides, Preston has lectured across the United States and has appeared on countless podcasts and television shows and written for numerous publications. Preston, I'm delighted to finally welcome you to Mysteries and Monsters. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me on the show. I'm excited.
Oh, I'm excited to have you. Like I say, you're a gentleman I've been aware of for a very long time. So apologies that I've not reached out previously. You've had a long interest in ufology. I think you kind of got bitten by the bug in the mid-'80s and realised that there was a lot of strange things going on in your social circles. So have you found the last 35 years more interesting than you could have possibly imagined, Preston?
Oh, I sure have. I would never in a million years thought I'd be here. I mean, I just didn't believe in UFOs. To find out my family was seeing them, friends, coworkers, that was a huge shock. This definitely made me take a left turn into the Twilight Zone. But yeah, I love it. The world is far more interesting than I ever could have imagined.
Is it surprising when you look back at how the culture in regards to ufology and the paranormal and things like that, Preston, seems to have really developed since you started taking an interest in it? Do you think we're in a situation these days where these subjects are easier for people to come forward and be honest about compared to when you first started investigating these cases?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. When I first started, people were very skeptical. And a lot of people looked at me and basically just told me I was crazy. It divided my family. My dad was not happy. He's like, stop talking about UFOs. My brothers, they're like, what's wrong with you? I'm like, I'm telling you, this is real. So, yeah, it was very much a different world. And now it's far more accepted. We're still not, I think, where we could be. There's still a lot of people who are skeptical out there, but now there's so much evidence. There's so many people talking about this. All these recent disclosures with, here in the U.S., the Pentagon's talking about them, becoming front page news. Yeah, things are definitely different.
Yeah, it certainly seems to be a period of time that I never thought we'd get to, Preston, as someone that's had a long interest in this subject as well. I certainly can't remember a time where it seems that we're having a mature conversation about this subject these days, rather than just being very dismissive or treating witnesses and experiences with disdain, which seem to be the general public perception of this. There are numerous people I can think of from countries around the world, Preston, who've gone on television with the best intentions to tell their stories and been completely ridiculed in front of audiences and on television shows. And there are numerous clips out there with people being laughed at by an audience, which I've always found rather distasteful. So do you find that since this disclosure's hit the headlines and gone around the world, you've had more people coming forward, or do you think it's a similar kind of situation that these people are very convinced about what's happened to them or what they've seen, Preston, and it hasn't changed them?
I think definitely more people are coming forward. They're feeling a bit more comfortable. I always ask people when I interview them, and possibly write about their case, is it okay if I use your name? And they used to say, no, please don't. I would lose my job. My family does not know. I haven't talked to anybody about this. And now most people will say, oh, yeah, it's fine. Use my name. I don't care. And when the subject would come on the news, newscasters would just kind of laugh about it, choke nervously, and move on. It's definitely being taken a lot more seriously. I came into this field very naive. I had no idea there was a cover-up. I had no idea that this was being taken seriously at the highest levels of government, which it absolutely is. So, yeah, it's very interesting to see how things are changing. I am not sure we're ever going to get the truth out of our governments, but we're starting to get some real pushback from the UFO community, and the cover-up has been a disaster. It really has. I mean, there's so many whistleblowers coming out of the woodwork saying this is real.
Yeah.
It's quite an interesting situation right now to see how things are changing. But yeah, there's a lot of people who are having these experiences. It's not just one or two, it's millions.
Yeah. And
major experiences. I mean, like being taken on board might sound rare, but I'm not so sure it's a rare experience. I think it's quite common.
Yeah. I mean, it is often surprising. I can remember the other year I was reading an article, Preston, and it was almost as if this person had no knowledge of the UFO subject, because they basically just said, well, UFOs only appear over the States, and nobody else in the world reports them. And even, I think, anybody with a passing interest in ufology will know that's absolute nonsense. Preston, are you still surprised that when certain media outlets stick their nose into this subject, sometimes they can seem woefully ignorant to anything that seems to be going on outside of their very narrow knowledge base?
Yeah, it's shocking. I've seen this with witnesses too, because a lot of people don't realize how much evidence there is out there. People who are having encounters often don't read books on UFOs because, they're sort of afraid. So it's very interesting to hear from someone who, say, has seen ETs face to face or been taken on board or had missing time or what have you, and start describing details that I'm very familiar with and they've never heard before. And yeah, I see people within the media all the time saying things that are just flat out not true. Like, do your homework. It's not that hard. Take 15 minutes to investigate this subject. And I truly believe any objective person who takes the time to look at the evidence can only come away convinced. There is so much evidence.
Mm-hmm. It is surprising because I know, as you refer to about the US government, the UK government's very similar. We've basically not had any official kind of follow-on from what's going on your side of the Atlantic at all, Preston, which is a bit peculiar. But I find it very odd that there'll always be countries that we've been aware of, such as Belgium, Chile as well, as especially well known, where they seem to have a very official, relaxed attitude to this situation, and they've been quite open in the fact that they say, yeah, there's strange things going on and we're not sure what's going on. And yet, when other people look at this subject, they'll just dismiss everything out of hand. And you think, well, if some countries are taking this subject very seriously, they can't usually use the normal uneducated excuses or say that these people are all suffering mass hysteria, because we're talking about Air Force pilots and military organisations in different countries that believe something strange is going on.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't think people realize that we have presidents who've seen UFOs, heads of state, senators, representatives, governors, very high-level military officials. And it's very interesting to see how each country sort of grapples and deals with this situation. And often what we see is people who are formerly in government or in the military, and after they've left, that's when they start coming out and talking about it. And each country, I think, has made significant strides. Most of the major, what we would call superpowers, have released tons of documents about this, but absolutely some are far more open. Mexico, for example, has had some encounters. There was a wave of sightings during the solar eclipse in 1991, where some 30 people were actually able to videotape this metallic disc over Mexico City. And this got into the media, and it was so obviously unexplained that there was no way the government could deny it. So they didn't even try. They didn't, they would look stupid.
Yeah.
I think that's not where we're at. This is why I think we're having disclosure, because if governments don't start disclosing, they will lose all credibility. They need to disclose if they want to have any control over this subject. I don't think they're doing it voluntarily. I think they're doing it kicking and screaming all the way, dragging their feet. But they have to, because no one will ever believe a word that comes out of their mouths if they don't start admitting that they know something is going on. I think they know far more than they're saying, obviously. I think they know this is ETs. I think we have the bodies, we have the craft. They know. For them to say, we're not sure what this is, frankly, disingenuous. They know.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I've always been really interested in a wide or a broad church when it comes to the UFO phenomenon, Preston. And I think often we find certain cases tend to sort of resonate with a lot of people a lot more than the officials would like it to happen. And it's very interesting, I think, because of the proliferation of social media these days. Like you say, I don't think they've got much choice anymore. This situation is the genie's out the bottle, as they'd say. And they can't put the top back on, and they're just basically being dragged kicking and screaming into the light to kind of admit what's going on. And it's very interesting that I never thought I'd see an official channel admit that, as the US recently did, that I think they released 146 reports and only one was explainable. That for me is just a remarkable admission that, as you say, they're fully aware something's been going on, and they've just basically sat on it for so long. And it's refreshing, but as you say, I think this is only a trickle. There's clearly a lot more to this than meets the eye, and we should be careful that what we accept in this current climate isn't what we think is the be all and end all. There's clearly a lot more to this than we currently believe. Yeah,
I was very interested to see how we all knew this disclosure step was coming up here in the U.S. And they released this 6-7 page report, which, I was hoping would be a lot more than it was. I was hoping they would show us some real photos, some films, maybe a piece of metal, something. But it just turned out to be 6 pages of mostly lies. It really was a big letdown. I think the best thing that came out of it was a tiny step forward. For the first time, they actually left open the possibility that this was extraterrestrial. They used that word only once. They said, we don't know what this is. It could be a foreign government, China, Russia, could be the U.S. One was a balloon. I'm like, oh gosh, here they are studying sightings when we're thinking, well, what about the landing cases? What about all the people who've been taken on board? why aren't you mentioning Roswell or the many other reports of UFO crashes? There's much bigger cases than just simple sightings. And they're saying, there's no evidence for extraterrestrial out of one side of the mouth, and out of the other, they're describing these metallic craft that are traveling at thousands of miles an hour and hovering, and they're silent, and they're flying around our jets. And this is just a frustrating situation.
Yeah. It would be interesting. I've noticed that as well, that out of the whole subject matter, they do tend to currently just be focusing on sightings, Preston. They're not going anywhere near crashes or landings or abductions or anything. They're not mentioning any of those. And I think for many of us that have followed this subject and been involved in it, or investigators and researchers such as yourself, I think it's plainly obvious that at the moment they're trying to control the narrative as though it's only sightings. We only see them flying. But as numerous people have come forward over the years, some people have had very frightening experiences, as you referred to earlier: loss of time, transportation, waking up feeling as though something's changed. Often some people have reported waking up and their clothes being the wrong way around, or they have sort of faded memories of being somewhere and being examined or being questioned or being told universal truths that aren't available to normal people such as you or I. And I think, as you say, the official line at the minute seems to be, well, it's just happening in the skies. But I think there's clearly far more to this, and it would be interesting to see, are we going to get that next step when they start to look at the other facets of the UFO phenomenon?
Yeah, I think it's inevitable. I think this is one of the reasons why it's been so difficult for governments to talk about this, because it opens up a can of worms. It's not just sightings. They know that millions of people are being taken on board these craft. That's where I focus most of my research, because I think that's where we're going to get the most pay dirt. That's where the information is. Sightings can only tell us so much. But when you talk to people who've had face-to-face contact or been taken on board, you start to really get a handle on what's going on here, who's inside these UFOs, what their agenda is, why they're here, where this is moving towards. So at some point, it's inevitable, I think, that this all goes into the mainstream. At some point, it's got to be taught in schools. It's going to be, there's just, the truth has a way of taking care of itself. And if this is a real phenomenon, and I think the evidence shows that it is, at some point we have to face it. You cannot hide the sky. So many people are seeing this, and more and more are stepping forward. I mean, we have celebrities now who are talking about being taken on board. Government officials, all kinds of people are stepping forward. And it's now, I'm so happy to see mainstream news, and that sort of giggle factor is slowly fading away.
Yeah, I think one of the most frustrating things is whenever we used to have these reports reported on British media outlets, Preston, they would often use two normal things. They would always mention Little Green Men, and they would always use the X-Files theme. It seemed like these were the generic ways to kind of just laugh at these people. And it has been refreshing to see that, thank God, that these cliches don't seem to be used anymore, thankfully. And like, as I said earlier, it seems that we're actually finally having a mature conversation about this situation.
Yeah, it's a shame that our governments haven't disclosed much sooner. And I think that's why we're seeing such high levels of activity. Every 5 or 10 years, there's a major wave of sightings, or where it cannot be denied, and it breaks through to the mainstream media, whether it's, the Phoenix Lights, 1994, or Hudson Valley Wave in upstate New York in the early 80s, Gulf Breeze. Belgium had a huge wave in the 90s. France had a major wave in the 1950s. That was undeniable. So I think the ETs are basically doing what I would call a grassroots campaign, sort of a publicity campaign of announcing their presence in a way that is slightly under the radar, but also undeniable. And they're just getting closer and closer and closer to the point where will accept their presence.
Definitely. And I think one of the aspects, as you mentioned there, about the education of this subject and it being taught in schools, you did a fantastic book about schoolyard UFO encounters, which is always an aspect of this whole phenomenon that has really intrigued me. And I know most people will know about probably the two most famous ones, which ironically happened outside of Europe and America, which is Westall in Australia in 1966 and the Aerial School in Zimbabwe in 1994. But I know your book, you've got about 100 cases from all over the US and around the world. And it was really nice, Preston, I have to say, to see someone from outside of the UK talk about what happened in Haverfordwest in 1977, because that's one of those UK sightings that very few people really know about here. And I find it quite peculiar that the general consensus is that, as I said there, you've got Zimbabwe in 94, Westall in 66, and for a lot of people, that seems to be the only school encounters they know. But you have done so much research, and I know recently on your YouTube channel, you had a couple of fascinating calls from witnesses over a couple of incidents in Southern California as well.
Yeah, this was really quite a shock for me. I've been involved in this field for decades and have actually investigated a few what I would call schoolyard encounters myself. And I remember hearing about the Rua, Zimbabwe case where the UFOs landed next to the playground, ETs got out, a bunch of the school children saw it. And it was such an impressive case, world famous, probably the most famous case, or one of the top in the world, certainly. Certainly in the continent of Africa. And I remember thinking, wow, didn't that happen in Australia?
Yes.
And I looked up the Westall case of, 1966, I believe it was. And I'm like, wow, they landed next to the school there. That's really interesting. And I started to, I think I remember another case here in the U.S., which isn't quite as famous, but has now become fairly well known. It occurred 1 year to the day, actually, after the Westall case. This occurred in Opelika, Florida, at Crestview Elementary School. And again, it was the same thing. 200 kids and teachers, by the way, saw these UFOs land next to the school. I'm like, wow, this is amazing, because landings are pretty rare. Daylight sightings are pretty rare. Yeah, in all three of these cases, there was landings. So I started looking deeper, and I remembered a case in Broadhaven, Wales, Broadhaven Elementary School. Yeah. And that's a super famous case. And it was the same darn thing. The UFOs landed. It was seen by students, and not only students, school officials later admitted that they saw it too. Not at first, but later they did admit that they saw this happen. And that's when I started really digging deeper. And what a shock I got to find out that this was absolutely a thing, and has been going on since at least 1950, all the way to the present day, and has some really interesting patterns. One is this is worldwide. We've got cases in Canada, all across the U.S., Mexico, all across South America, Africa, all across Europe, England, of course. I didn't find any cases in Russia, I think because information is hard to get out of Russia sometimes. But China, I found cases. Australia, of course, New Zealand. And another weird thing is, your average sighting is usually an anomalous light at night. It's pretty high up there. It darts around and off it goes. It's very brief. These schoolyard cases are completely the opposite. In these cases, the schools are specifically targeted. By that, I mean these objects will appear from, say, the horizon or way up high in the sky and just drop down or head directly towards the school and stop or circle around it. It's clear that they are absolutely coming to the school specifically. And they're very low-level sightings. These, I would say, 100 feet is about the average, 50 feet lower. in 1/3 of these cases, there are landing and or humanoids are seen. So that is like, wow, 1/3 of the cases. That's shocking. And these are long-lasting sightings too. It's not just a minute. Though some, there are a few which are short, but most are, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, even over a period of days in some cases. And they're putting on displays. They'll release smaller craft. They'll flash their lights. They'll land. Humanoids will come out. It's really quite striking how sort of, I guess I would call them displays almost. They want to be seen. So it's very interesting sort of patterns to these cases.
Yeah. I think it's very interesting as well, like you say, that often these cases are usually dismissed by some as children's overactive imaginations or mass hysteria, as the Zimbabwe case has often been dismissed as that. And it's almost as if that they ignore all the adult witnesses in many of these cases as well, Preston, that it's only the children have caused this. It's just overexcitable children. I know the Broadhaven one was famous because a lot of the kids simply got sick of talking about it, and the media descended on the school in Wales and just wouldn't leave them alone. And it got to the point that they just didn't want to talk about it anymore, primarily because people kept telling them that they'd seen something that was easily explainable. I know Westall is described as people and as described as the children mistaking a weather balloon, which is one of those old excuses that we're sick of receiving these days, Preston. That it's a weather balloon, or the other aspect of it is that when the weather balloon excuse fails to explain how it levitated upwards and shot off, they say, oh well, it was a plane with a windsock. But you've got tens and hundreds of people seeing something. I can't possibly comprehend the fact that none of these kids could see it, could tell what an aeroplane was, or could tell what a balloon was, because their description doesn't match a balloon. It doesn't look like a plane. And we find that seems to be prescribed to many of these schoolyard cases, that people just dismiss them because it's kids. And I don't think that's a very valid standpoint.
Yeah, it's not valid for a couple of reasons. Yeah, kids can be imaginative, certainly, but also they're, unfiltered. You can easily kind of tell when they're lying. They don't overlay interpretations on it. They don't have a belief system that is all complex and sort of distorting their perceptions. Most of these cases, they've never even heard of UFOs. They don't know the term. They just report exactly what they're seeing. And the fact that these are not a single witness in almost all of these cases, as a general rule, these are very widely viewed. 10 kids, 20 kids, 40, 100, 200. There's a case in New Zealand where there was 400 kids at Richmond School in Maranui, New Zealand, where this object came and hovered over the playground. 400 kids and teachers saw this. It stayed there for 15 minutes, and no one was able to identify it. Half of these cases, the teachers are seeing them. Remember, teachers are fairly well educated. That's their job. And to say that this is just, kids' imagination, I'm like, wait a second. There's 100 kids. Not one of them has ever retracted their story. This is something that affects them profoundly for the rest of their lives. Some of them have become researchers themselves. I would point to the case of Malcolm Robinson, who was Bankery Elementary School playing football with his friends one day. And they look up and there's this huge globe-shaped object. And they're all looking at it like, could that be a balloon? Doesn't look like it. It's perfectly still in the sky. And Malcolm described it as being really quite beautiful. And they looked away for a second and boom, it's gone, which should be impossible. And it affected him deeply. And he ended up writing UFOs over Scotland 1 and 2. He's now one of Scotland's major UFO researchers. And that's not unusual. A number of these people have gone on to become, astrophysicists or teachers or UFO researchers or writing about their case. So I think that perhaps that's one of the agendas of the ETs, is to not only announce their presence to school children, but in a way sort of inspire them to spread the word about ET presence on our planet.
Absolutely. And I think it is very enlightening when we look at some of these cases. And as you refer to there, some of the people that have had these experiences, clearly, Preston, for a lot of them, it's a very emotional incident. As you say, it changes people's lives. It makes them look at the world in a very different way. So when you were investigating this, as you said, you knew a couple of the main cases, and then it was almost like dominoes falling. Are you surprised that more of these cases aren't more well known? Because as you refer to, especially the one in New Zealand, these are mass sightings on a scale that even well-known normal UFO cases that don't involve schools seem to be a handful of witnesses, one or two witnesses, maybe a dozen at sometimes. Obviously, the Phoenix Light is one of the key modern ones where we have more than the normal handful of witnesses. So were you surprised that more of these cases aren't more well known in the wider world and in ufology?
Yeah, I was very much shocked because these types of cases are unlike anything out there in the UFO literature. There are sometimes large groups of people who see UFOs, but hundreds of people seen over and over again, there's no other cases quite like this. I mean, I looked into concerts and sporting events and other gatherings of large people, and there are a few cases where, UFOs have appeared over a soccer match or a concert, but only a few that I could find. Not the 100 that I found with the schoolyards. And I have to tell you, that's just the tip of the iceberg. I'm going to have to put out another book because I've got about 50 more already.
Wow.
I mean, I am shocked that this is not more well known. Often these cases will get into the local media, but it stops there usually, but not always. And I find it really interesting that Australia's most famous case is the Westall case.
Yeah.
Africa's most famous case is absolutely the Rua, Zimbabwe case. Probably the same with Wales, the Broadhaven School. And here in the U.S., one of the most famous cases in the U.S. would be the Hillsdale College incident. And I'm going to put that in this category because some 80 students and school officials, 90 of them, saw this UFO hovering over the school for a period of 2 hours. And like in a third of these cases, it landed in the fields in front of the school. Landed. This was seen by police officers as well. This is a very, very well authenticated case and super famous. And one of the few that really sort of broke through this media skepticism. I started realizing, hey, some of the most famous cases in the world are in fact schoolyard encounters. But most, do not get publicity. And I think, the Westall case was very effectively covered up for years, as was the Opalaka case in Florida. Military officials showed up and said, you did not see this. What you saw was helicopters or balloons. You are not to talk about this. And that can be very effective, especially for little kids who, tend to obey authority. Certainly back then, more so than perhaps today.
Yes.
But authority had a lot more power back in the 50s and 60s. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. I am telling you, this happens far, far more often than people realize. And it's very interesting how the ETs do this, because the Hillsdale case occurred in March of 1966. And this was a major publicity event. And Jim and Cora Lorenzen, who were pioneering U.S. researchers, wrote about the Hillsdale case. And they said, this is interesting to us because we have several cases where UFOs are hovering over schools already. And we think they're doing this on purpose to sort of announce their presence. And Raymond Fowler, another pioneering investigator, said the same thing. He said of the 15 cases he had at that time period, 8 had occurred over schools. And Jim and Cora Lorenzen said, this is likely to happen again. And little did they know that 2 weeks later, Westall would happen. And it's like the ETs know exactly what they're doing. And to me, it's kind of reminiscent of a book tour or a concert tour by musicians where they're just going from city to city and, playing their music, talking about their book, publicizing. This is absolutely, I think, their agenda. They are going to the most impressionable people in our society, kids, who are, soak up knowledge like sponges. And it's been very effective. Now our younger generations have almost a universal belief in UFOs.
Have you come across situations, Preston? Because obviously, as you mentioned there, Westall, there are numerous allegations of mysterious officials turning up, people confiscating photographs, cameras, promising to return them, and obviously then they disappear and they're never seen again. When you've looked into some of the cases in the US, have we had this kind of official secret suppression going on? Or do you think it's only certain cases that break out so largely as Westall did, that you had so many people and there was a real furore, teachers had seen it, everybody was perplexed by what had happened, and then all of a sudden this strange alleged cover-up occurred where people are claiming that for some people they thought that they were US Army, and the Australian government said, well, the US Army doesn't come into Australia or whatever. Have you found similar situations in some of the reports in the US and Canada and other countries, or do you think it's the more notable cases where these kind of things try to be activated to close this situation down?
Yeah, I would say it's consistent, but it's not super common. It's only the cases that start to create a real uproar where the military steps in and starts issuing what I would call debunking statements or trying to cover it up or threatening people, which did happen with Crestview Elementary School in 1967, and absolutely in Westall. But that didn't happen with the Rua Zimbabwe case for whatever reason. There was no real military involvement there. And we don't generally see that because these cases don't receive a lot of publicity. But they certainly do get some local publicity. There was a case in Marysville, Ohio at Jerome Elementary School, which was a fantastic case where UFOs were hovering over the playground, seen by the teachers as well. They sent down this weird substance we now call angel hair, which I'm not sure if you've heard of this, but it's quite bizarre. It's this cotton candy sort of spiderweb-like substance.
Yeah.
That is very rarely, there's really only a handful of cases compared to the, hundreds of thousands of sightings. Angel hair cases number in perhaps 100 of them.
Yeah.
And it coated the playground. It dropped loads of this weird material onto the playground. And this was quite a big event. The press covered it pretty extensively locally. It never really made, it was somewhat national news, but not international. But they collected bits of this substance, and it did get military interest. They sent samples of it to Lockbourne Air Force Base, but never heard back from them. They never talked about it. It was years later, investigators found out that a Major White working at the Pentagon did actually study this case in Marysville, Ohio, and said it was the one case that year which really had them scratching their heads. They couldn't identify it. It was clearly something very unusual. But it's, again, another case of where these objects are clearly trying to be seen. UFOs are often really evasive, and you can't just walk outside and see a UFO whenever you want. But in these schoolyard cases, they are coming down when kids are at recess to very low levels and putting on these displays where they absolutely are trying to be seen. I don't see how we can come to any other conclusion.
Have you found when you've looked into some of these cases, Preston, that it's not just one event? Because often, I know the Broadhaven event, a lot of people just presumed it was a school sighting. And then when UFO investigators started looking around it, there were people on the farms around the school that had been seeing strange things for a couple of weeks. And I know one farmer's cows had been moved from one field to another overnight. People were saying that lights were shining in their bedroom windows at 3 a.m. and they were seeing strange things bobbing over their fields. When you've looked into some of these other school encounters, I think often, as can happen with many famous UFO encounters as well, Preston, people tend to focus on the main event and don't look the day before or the day after or the week before or that month or whatever. Have you found more meat to the bones of these stories, that it's not just this one incident that occurs over the school?
In some cases, that's absolutely true. With the Rua, Zimbabwe case, there was a wave of sightings all around that time. And yet, not landings, not ETs coming out and talking to people so much as they did at the Rua, Zimbabwe case. So it looks as though it is part of a complex of more cases in some of these cases, but often no. I mean, the Richmond school incident in New Zealand, there was an airport not far from the school, and they absolutely denied seeing anything. And it was pretty much a one-off. It was just this sighting over the school. And that happened again in Arizona. There was this incident at Florence Elementary School, and there was an airport right next door. They did not see anything. No one else in the area saw anything. It's clear in some of these cases they are coming down just for these students. So I think it goes both ways. Really hard to say because a lot of people don't talk about their sightings. I would say the majority. This is something I always ask people when I interview them. I'm like, who did you report your sighting to? Anybody, any official body, a UFO organization, the Mutual UFO Network here in the U.S., National UFO Reporting Center, NUFORC, the police, the Air Force. I would say it's about 1 in 50. And that's being generous, actually, report their sighting in any official capacity. So any estimates as to how many people are seeing this stuff, or if there are other witnesses, are vastly underestimated. Most people aren't talking.
Yeah. When it comes to these landing cases, Preston, how many of them are involving the occupants of the vehicles coming out? Because obviously one of the key aspects of the Zimbabwe case is that the occupants were described as little grey men. And I found it quite interesting that some of the witnesses didn't consider them to be aliens. They thought that they were tolkoshis, which are their, creatures from folklore. And I found that a very interesting aspect because once again, as you referred to earlier, often these stories are kind of dismissed as kids watching too much television, or they've culturally been sort of corrupted into believing into aliens and little grey men. So I find that aspect of the Zimbabwe case very interesting, that clearly these children hadn't been corrupted because as far as they were concerned, these were these creatures of their local tribal myths. So in some of the other cases, have children described, and the teachers, I suppose, described seeing the occupants? And if so, are there different types that these people are reporting, or are they tending to be one particular sort of alleged extraterrestrial visitor?
Different types, absolutely. And it's amazing how many cases there are involving humanoids. I get mostly grays. And when I interview people, most people who say they've been taken on board or had some sort of face-to-face encounter will describe grays. Over half. Though I do get cases of human-looking ETs, praying mantis, strange humanoids. When it comes to the Schoolyard cases, there seems to be quite a bit more variation. I'm not sure if that's because this is a worldwide phenomena, but here's a case where I was able to speak with the witnesses firsthand, or at least one of them, which occurred at, I think it was Point Elementary School in Missouri. This was right around the time of the Michigan case at Hillsdale College, 1966. And the witness I talked to, her name was Melody. She was just a little girl at a Point Elementary School. This is in Missouri. And she and some of, all the kids were on the playground. And she and about 6 people decided they weren't going to play ball or foursquare with the other kids. They were going to play tag out on the football field, the far end of the playground. This is a pretty rural area. There was a farm next to the school, or behind the school. And so they go off to the far edge, and they see these little footprints on the playground. And they were clearly, bipedal. And they're looking at them, trying to figure out what they could be, when they see this light in the woods right behind the school, where the farm is. And the first thought is, oh, ice cream truck, which I thought was really cute.
Yeah.
And they went run, they're not supposed to leave the school grounds, obviously. But they decided, it's so close, let's go look, let's get some ice cream.
Yeah.
So they leave the school grounds and head towards this clump of trees, and they come upon a UFO. It's a saucer-shaped craft. It's landed. It's got a little light on top. And as they're walking towards it, they stop because there's a humanoid figure very close to them, like less than 50 feet away. And all 6 of them kind of line up in a row and look at this humanoid figure. And they described it as being very odd looking. This was not like any ET I've really heard before or since. They said it was quite short, did have large, dark eyes, and that is a description I hear quite a bit. But they said its face looked more like a gorilla almost, like a primate. And then it was very muscular, like a gymnast. It was wearing a dark jumpsuit, and it was just staring right at them. I mean, they were locked gazes looking at it. And as soon as it sees them and they see it, it stops and starts backing up towards this craft and slowly starts going into it, at which point a teacher appears. Mrs. Ohlendorf comes from behind the students and screams. She's absolutely hysterical and pulls all the kids back into the classroom. At this point, a bunch of kids in the playground can see this craft, blinking through the trees, and everyone's quite excited. She pulls them all into her class, and all the kids, of course, rush to the windows to see it. And she's frantically closing the blinds, trying to stop them from seeing it, and calling the other teachers and the principal. It was a big deal. And school was cut short. This often happens. They will, send the kids home. And they started ushering all the kids out of the classrooms and into the gymnasium and getting the school buses ready and doing everything they could to, stop all this panic and this excitement. And suddenly one of the kids shouts out, "There it goes!" He saw it through the gymnasium windows, which were quite high up. And it was the talk of the school for weeks. The teachers kept trying to stop the kids from talking about it, but they refused, and it caused quite an uproar for months. It's a very interesting case involving a very strange humanoid, but I've heard all different types. There's a case involving a 6-7 foot tall greenish humanoid, little short dark skinned humanoids. The Rua Zimbabwe case had very similar descriptions. Some of the kids said these figures looked like grays. Mm-hmm. Others said no, one of them had hair along its head and down its back. So you hear all different types of descriptions, from tall entities to short entities to even robotic-looking entities. It's really quite interesting.
Yeah. Do you often find that the children seem to be quite blasé about it? Because as you were saying there, it seems that the kids were quite enthralled by meeting this strange monkey-like creature. And yet it's the teacher that starts screaming and panics, Preston. Have you found that seems to happen? Because it seems often the children are very matter-of-fact about what's going on, and they don't seem to be as frightened as perhaps the adults are. Do you think that's because the adults have the knowledge or the maturity to actually understand what's going on, and therefore they're more frightened than perhaps the kids who, like you say in that particular case, sweetly presumed that an ice cream van had just arrived?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Kids aren't discriminating. They don't have, I'll just say it bluntly, they're not racist. You know what I mean? They aren't fearing someone just because they look a little different.
Yeah.
They don't have any experience with that. Just because something is a little different out of their worldview, to them, everything is new. Everything is absolutely being seen for the first time. So I think when a UFO shows up, they kind of take it in stride. Like, oh, look at that. How interesting. There's a case where a UFO was hovering very low over the playground, and all the kids were looking at it, and one of the kids went up to the teachers and said, "What's that?" And the teacher became visibly shaken. And this happens quite a bit. Some of the new cases I've got involve this sort of reaction where the kids are fine with it, and the teachers suddenly see it and they're like, "Oh my God!" And they start ushering the kids back inside and like, "Don't look." So the kids, absolutely don't seem, not in every case. I mean, there was one case at Prestonburg, Kentucky. One of the first case I could find, actually. Well, second case. I did find one very early case in 1853 over Vburl College in Tennessee, which was a really interesting display of lights over a college in Tennessee. But really, this started around 1950. The earliest case modern that I could find was at Prestonburg Elementary School in Kentucky. And these two UFOs came swooping down so low over the playground that it scared the living daylights out of all the students. One who fainted, another threw up. They scattered. Poor teacher, Mrs. Holbrook, completely freaked out. pulled all the kids into the classroom, tried to calm them down. And then the UFOs made a second appearance, which they sometimes do. And this time there was, first time was 2 craft. This time it was 4. And they came even lower. And again, caused quite a panic among the kids. In this case, the UFOs were emitting a very loud noise, which is quite unusual. And I think they did it on purpose, honestly.
Yeah.
Because in most cases, these UFOs are absolutely silent. They don't need to make a noise. I think they kind of did it on purpose to draw attention. But it's amazing how this happens. There was a case in Glasgow, Scotland, another early case, which I love. It's such an interesting case. This was in the summer of 1952. And all the kids, school had just been released. And everyone was walking out of school onto the playground. And suddenly this huge circular shadow comes over the playground. Everyone looks up, including many of the teachers and school officials. And here's this huge metallic object shaped kind of like a sombrero hat, is how the witnesses have described it. Totally silent, very low level. And this thing, as it always does, comes right for this school and stops right over it, about 20 to 50 feet over the little steeple there at Elder Park Elementary, and hovers there, just stays there for about 5 to 10 minutes. One of the witnesses says that, they asked, "How long did this happen?" And she gave a very interesting description. She says, "I don't know. It seemed like time stopped. It could have been a long time. I can't really tell you." And I found that fascinating because that's what the kids at Rua, Zimbabwe said.
Yeah.
That they had difficulty, telling how long this happened. That's what another lady told me. She had an object come down over Mentor Catholic Elementary School in Mentor, Ohio. I'm like, "How long did it take? Was it there?" She says, "I can't tell you. It was as if time stopped." This is absolutely something we see with abduction cases, which makes me wonder, is there missing time here?
Yeah.
At any rate, with this Glasgow, Scotland case, this object finally starts to rev up, makes a pretty fairly loud buzzing noise, spins real fast, tilts a little bit, and takes off. And all the kids are freaking out, and they run home, and they tell their parents, many who did not believe them. But it turned out the next day, this did make the papers, because it went directly over downtown Glasgow, and a lot of people saw it, and the kids got their vindication when this came out in the papers, and they're like, see, I told you, because a lot of adults saw this as well. And it was a major case and got quite a bit of publicity.
Yeah.
But it's such an interesting case because here again, we have these objects staying there, very low level. What are they doing? Why? What is going on here? I kind of, I'm like, it's clear they want to be seen. That much is clear to me. But why? Why would they do that? Why do they want people to know? And what my conclusion is? I'm just speculating here because this is something we see. With the Phoenix lights and other UFO waves, I think they're trying to get us used to their presence for a reason. I think that reason is that eventually, and perhaps soon, we're going to have open official contact. They're going to show themselves in a way that's permanently undeniable. That will come and visit us in a way where every single person on Earth now knows that UFOs are real. We're not going to call them UFOs anymore. Well, we might, but I mean, let's face it, a UFO is an extraterrestrial craft. And I think at some point, this is going to be a known fact and not, quote, a mystery.
Definitely. Do you think, as well, Preston, when it comes to these schoolyard encounters, as you say, I'm very struck how close these encounters tend to be as well. Are you surprised that, as often, these cases are dismissed as misidentification or normal phenomenon? Because I know we talk about Westall and what happened at Ariel, but when we're talking about what happened in these other cases and Glasgow and the like, these people are very close to what they're supposedly misidentifying, Preston. And I find it extremely difficult to believe that, regardless of the children, that a group of adults can misidentify a balloon, a plane, a meteor, some other kind of flying contraption, because every kind of flying contraption is put forward as an excuse, even if it makes less sense than a unidentified flying object in some cases.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that, along with the fact that they seem to be aware of when they will be seen by the most amount of children, it's almost as if they know when lunchtime is, or when school's finishing, or when they've got sport practice, or something like that, Preston. There are some really interesting strands to these stories and these phenomena that, as you say, it's like they want to be seen, but how many of them are distant lights? Like you say, these seem to be extremely close encounters for these children and the adults around them.
Yeah, that's what I absolutely love about these cases. That's what I find so striking about them, is they are so close. They are landing in so many cases, and this absolutely removes the possibility of misperception. These are too close to say that, oh, this was a balloon. Here's a great case, and I think this shows how this can fly under the radar and not get more publicity. And this is one of the few cases which occurred at night. This was on April 22nd, 1966, which was a huge year for schoolyard encounters. This was like right in between, I think, the Hillsdale College case and the Westall case. I mean, they were coming down and really trying to show themselves. This was at Beverly High School in Massachusetts, where a little girl who lived next to the school came running into the house and said, "Mom, there's a UFO. It just went right over the street and towards Beverly High School." And her mom was having a little dinner party. And she said, "Emily, be quiet." And she's like, no. She was jumping up and down. She was frantic. And it was clear that, okay, she was begging them to just go outside and look. So her mother went with her two friends. So there's got three adult females. They step outside, and her daughter's saying it went to Beverly High School, which is about a block away, right over this little hill. So they walk down the street to Beverly High School, and there over the school are three objects. One's quite high up, another is fairly low, and another is hovering about 50 feet over the school itself. Inside the school, by the way, there's a big basketball game going on. So these three women are looking at these objects, and they're all clustered together, the women. The objects are somewhat separated. And one of the women raises her hand to wave at the closest object, at which point it immediately drops down right over them to about lower than treetop level, about 20 feet over them, and scared the living daylights out of them. They screamed. Two of them scattered and ran. One was frozen in fear to the spot, so afraid she actually soiled herself.
Wow.
She peed her pants, and her friends are screaming, "Run, get out of there, run." Finally, they all run home and gather everyone in the house and the neighbors, and a group of about 10, 12 people come back, and these objects are still there. They call the police. The police show up and said, "Okay, who called about the plane?" and they point to the object over the school, which is, the closest one. And the policemen jump out of their car. Their eyes get all wide. They're visibly shaken.
Yeah.
And they're all looking at this, and finally it darts away. And by the way, it went straight to Gordon College about 5 minutes away and hovered over Gordon College and scared the daylights out of a bunch of people on the lawn, on the quad there, came swooping down to, again, about 20 feet and took off at a right angle and took off. So it hit one school and then went to another. But what's interesting about this case is Project Blue Book, which is the Air Force UFO study project, was alerted to this case and did a study of it. Well, I'll call it a study, but it wasn't really, because they did. It's, what a farce Project Blue Book turned out to be. At any rate, they didn't interview the witnesses. They just kind of reviewed the case. And they said that what these people thought was a UFO was not a UFO. What they thought they saw was actually Venus.
Good old Venus, Preston. I was wondering when that would turn up.
Venus. Can you imagine Venus causing someone to pee in their pants? Or the police to freak out? Or, come on. This is why J. Allen Hynek, the astronomical consultant, eventually left Project Blue Book and wrote his own books. Because it wasn't a true investigation.
No.
And Project Blue Book's conclusions were, there's nothing to this. It's not UFOs. You're misperceiving. These are hoaxes, hallucinations, and misperceptions.
Yeah.
That's why this Pentagon report is so important, because they did not say that. They left open the possibility that these are extraterrestrials. And that's a 180-degree turnaround and a tiny little baby step towards the truth.
It is remarkable when we look at some of the explanations that have been given over the years. I mean, the swamp gas, it's like a running joke in ufology, Preston. When anybody sees something strange in the sky, I know several people who go, oh, well, that's clearly swamp gas, with their tongue firmly in their cheek. Because anybody who knows, yes, swamp gas is flammable and it does combust. But it doesn't float above a swamp and make manoeuvres and do things that it was often put forward to as an explanation by Project Blue Book. And this is the same thing when you mentioned there. This poor woman's so terrified by this object dropping above her that she soils herself. Now, I'm unaware of any planetary object that has this kind of manoeuvrability. And for these people, this is often the perception that anybody who sees something, be they an adult or a child, Preston, that they're all idiots. They don't understand anything. They don't know what a plane looks like, or a hot air balloon, or a helicopter, Venus, Mars, Saturn, whichever planet they want to throw at it, a star. It's remarkable that so many people were fobbed off with this, because the other aspect of all this is as well, when we talk about UFO encounters, regardless of the age of the witness or their profession or anything, some people have a life-changing situation. I would imagine that everybody involved in that particular incident over that school had their life completely turned around, but at that time there simply wouldn't have been any kind of avenue for them to have a conversation outside of their own home, I would imagine. Yeah,
it's very interesting. And I think the ETs kind of do this on purpose. It's a way of announcing their presence without collapsing society. But I do love it when there are adult witnesses. And here's a great case. October 1957, Whitsett Elementary School, North Carolina, here in the U.S., again, during the day, 120 students were on the playground, and teachers and the principal, when multiple objects came over the school for about 10 to 15 minutes, and again sent down huge volumes of angel hair, thick enough to coat the entire playground. And all the kids were running around. They thought it was amazing. One kid actually scooped some up and put it in his mouth before the teacher could stop them. He spit it out. It tasted terrible, salty, he said.
Brilliant.
But it was a very interesting case, because it turns out the principal actually gathered samples of this angel hair and sent it off to Burlington science labs to see if they could identify it, and they couldn't. They said, we believe this is biological. We don't know what it is. It's a possibility it could be spider webs, but we don't think so. You should try sending it to a biologist. They might be able to identify it.
Yeah.
Which he did. And the biologist said, no, this is not spider webs. I don't know what it is. But what's also very interesting about this case by the way, that sample was stolen, mysteriously disappeared from his home. And he feels like there was foul play. But this case did grab the attention of the U.S. Air Force. And they sent over a representative, an Air Force captain by the name of Murray Thornton, who tried to debunk the case and said, what you think you saw as UFOs was just reflections on the clouds. And turns out the Principal Lambeth, had flown 46 combat missions in World War II and was very educated on aircraft. And absolutely would not have it, and sent a very terse letter back to them explaining that this was very widely viewed. He knows his aircraft. There's no way this was a reflection on the clouds. You don't know what you're talking about. It's just a really good example of how the Air Force is totally bungling this and trying to debunk it, when in fact the witnesses in many of these cases are very well educated and know exactly what aircraft are. There's just no way you can deny a case like this. It's so widely viewed and involves trained military observers.
Yeah. That with, they talk about, I've heard so many unusual explanations for these kind of things, Preston. And what you were saying there, that rang a bell, because when you're talking about angel hair and spiders, there's a very famous case from Italy about a UFO sighting above a football stadium during a match, and there were thousands of people at this game, and that was written off by a US investigator as people seeing migrating spiders. Thousands of people misidentified migrating spiders as a UFO.
Yeah, I know about that case. I did a whole study of the angel hair cases, which, by the way, they have gathered samples and studied it, and there's weird elements, calcium, magnesium, boron, which is really interesting because boron is something we actually use to shield nuclear materials.
Yeah.
So this apparently is some sort of, perhaps, we don't know what it is, but perhaps a byproduct of the UFO engines or the high level of plasmic fields and electric charges that surround these craft. It's still a mystery exactly how or what causes this.
It is interesting for me as well, Preston, when you have these encounters that do involve angel hair, because in some instances it seems to melt almost immediately, doesn't it, as soon as it makes landfall, and in other occasions like this one, the fact that one of the kids decided to try and eat it, I think is just a fabulous aspect of that case. But very few occasions do people, this is often the other thing when we talk about these encounters, very few people have the presence of mind to collect a sample of these things. And like you say, it's often very odd that when samples are collected, they disappear, or they get misplaced, or people stop returning the calls for people wanting to know what's happened to their sample.
Yeah, there are landing traces in a few of these cases that happened at Westall High School. Very clear landing cases. Shane Ryan is probably the lead investigator, has interviewed some 100 people who saw these landing traces, which were bulldozed over shortly after the incident. And that's something we see in all kinds of cases of UFO landings. Government officials will come in and bulldoze this over. This cover-up is no joke. It's not speculation. It's easily demonstrable through documents released through the Freedom of Information Act here in the U.S., and from other documents all across the world. We know there's a cover-up. And whenever there is physical evidence, this is when very serious actions are taken to try to mitigate the publicity and all the attention that's being put towards these types of incidents. It's such a shame. I don't know why governments can't be truthful, transparent, and forthcoming with this. Ultimately, I think it comes down to just greed and power and corruption. It's really a shame because our society could just advance so much more quickly if our governments truly had our best interests in mind and would just be forthcoming with this instead of being money, power-hungry people who are trying to, support the oil industry and so forth. I think that's one of the main reasons behind this cover-up, because we have this technology. And it would completely transform our economy, and it would destroy the oil industry. It would really just make a much better world, and I'm just not sure the military-industrial complex wants that.
Yeah, there's clearly other aspects at play here. And I know, as you referred there, when some of the witnesses mentioned that time seems to stand still for them, Preston, in some of these school cases. Have you uncovered anything where there's been sort of secondary incidents with some of the witnesses having experiences further down the line, or even people, when they've had these experiences at school, have suffered missing time and they don't seem to remember what's happened or where they were?
Yes, that does turn up. It's not super common. I'm going to say most of these cases I would describe them as close encounters of the first kind, simple sightings, or second kind where it affects the environment. But yes, I wonder about the time distortions in many of these cases. And well, here's an interesting case from Leonard Stringfield, a very well-respected researcher who's since passed on here in the U.S. He concentrated a lot on crash retrieval cases towards the second half of his career, but did all kinds of interviews with investigations into various UFO incidents. And he had this very interesting case which took place in, I believe it was Georgia, if I'm thinking correct. Yeah, I believe it was in Georgia. At any rate, involved this. He got a call from a gentleman who said his son was missing. And the story came out that turned out the previous day his son had come home from school saying that a UFO had followed him home from the school, and he was afraid it was going to abduct him. And his parents did not believe him and thought he was just making it up. And the next day he was missing, and they found a note on the kitchen table from their son saying, "I am running away. I'm afraid these guys are going to get me." He withdrew $500 out of the bank account and disappeared. And it turned out he had called Leonard Stringfield earlier and left a message on his machine. Leonard Stringfield wasn't home, so he just got the message.
Yeah.
So they were calling Leonard Stringfield to see if he could help. And meanwhile, the kid was found at the airport. He was getting ready to fly away somewhere. And they brought him home, and he was tearful and really upset and very emotional. And they brought in Leonard Stringfield and got the whole story out of this child who, it turned out 1 year earlier, he had been on the playground during the day when a UFO hovered over the playground. Everyone saw it, and he had the feeling that whoever was in this UFO was watching him, and really got this feeling like that they knew they were being observed. So he goes home, and that evening he was visited in his bedroom by entities who said, "Have no fear, don't be afraid, you need to come with us," and had missing time. And so when it happened again, he feared like, well, they're going to take me forever this time. So yeah, this does happen. That happened in the Rua, Zimbabwe case. One of the witnesses, Emily Trim, became what we would term a UFO contactee, abductee, and had regular visits and still is having regular visits by gray type extraterrestrials. She's gone public. She's talking about this right now. And this does turn up in some of these cases. I've got several cases like this. There's a case here, gosh, I forget the name of the school, but people are being abducted from the playground. Or grays will actually come onto the playground. One lady just wrote to me on Facebook. She says that there was a weird substitute teacher came to class one day, took them all out onto the playground. A UFO drops down real low. There's some time confusion. They all go back into class. Everyone wants to talk about it. And the substitute teacher says, "No, don't talk about it." And the next day, the normal teacher was back, and they never knew who the substitute teacher was. But she's kind of implying that perhaps she was actually an ET. And another lady said that she would be taken from class with groups of other students to a corner of the school where there would be grays who would teach them. And this happened in another case where a girl was approached on the playground by this strange-looking kid. And she saw kind of through it, because first he looked like a kid, but then suddenly she would see these big dark eyes and grayish skin and a big head. And this gray was telling her all this stuff that was hard for her to understand about mathematics and philosophy and science, and teaching her all this stuff. And she says this happened to other kids. And sometimes it caused trauma. That ambulance came on a few occasions. This usually happened in this field behind the school. The teachers ended up forbidding any kids to go into this grove of trees where all these incidents were taking place. She says it took place over a period of years. This happened multiple times.
My goodness.
Yeah, so there's more to this than just sightings in some of these cases.
Yeah. Do you often, because I've seen, as we've talked about, some of these witnesses, these children, when they have these experiences, Preston, some of them will say they feel they're being spoken to by whether it's a craft or the occupants coming out, regardless of what type of creatures these people are describing. Have you seen many people claim to be receiving a message or getting a feeling of knowledge or euphoria when they have this experience, or they feel that they're being spoken to, as that child said, that he seemed to be singled out by whatever this craft was?
Yeah, the Rua Zimbabwe case is the ultimate case of that kind, where the ETs did give messages to the children, which were universally about the environment.
Yeah.
Which is so interesting, because these are elementary kids, primary school age kids, who know really nothing about environmental concerns. And certainly this is 1994, when it wasn't the hot button topic it is today.
Mm.
And that was also a very rural area filled with, trees and forests and so forth. So it's just an odd message for children to get. And yet that's the primary message people as adults get when they're taken on board. But messages are fairly rare. Most of these, it's just sort of a hi, how are you type of thing.
Yeah.
But there are a few cases. There was a case in Colombia, which is not in my book because it was sort of sparked. I got a lot of cases coming in once the book came out.
Yeah.
And they apparently received messages as well about the environment. The Mentor Mentor Elementary School case I mentioned, Mentor, Ohio, where a 12-year-old girl and her classmates were all on the playground, saw this UFO drop down out of the sky. It landed in the grove of trees next to the school, as they always do.
Yeah.
She got a very clear message. And it was in English, a male voice that said, remember this day. Remember this day. And it took off. So it was a very simple message. And here's one more case real briefly, because I just love this case. And it shows how undiscriminating the ETs are. I mean, they contact people all over the world, all races. Half of the cases, by the way, are elementary school. And then, of course, junior high, high school, and college. But it's mostly elementary school. And this one case took place at the North Carolina School for the Deaf. This is in March of 1979.
Uh-huh.
And all the children are hard of hearing. They are deaf children. And this object comes overhead and swoops so low over the school that the school officials, the teachers, thought it was actually going to crash into the school. They were ducking down. This is how low it was. And all the students came running out because, mind you, these are deaf students. They cannot hear. This object was making a deep thrumming vibration, a noise that even the deaf children could feel or, quote, hear. So in a way, I think the ETs are doing this on purpose. I think they wanted to show themselves and announce their presence to even the deaf children. It's really quite touching.
Yeah.
And all these children came out and got to have this really awesome experience where they see this very large metallic craft just 50 feet overhead and making this very deep, deep thrumming noise that they could feel throughout their bodies.
Yeah.
And it just moves overhead and off into the distance. But again, leaves them profoundly aware of this phenomena. And it's just so amazing to me. Like, wow, that they came to the North Carolina School for the Deaf. That is just, some of these cases are just really touching to me. They bring tears to my eyes.
Yeah. And there seems to be in the majority of these cases, Preston, there seems to be quite a positive response from the witnesses. Like you say, as I was saying earlier on, the kids seem to be fine with it because they don't have any preconceived ideas. They don't have any biases. They don't have any bigotry. As far as they're concerned, these are just very interesting looking people. They don't know what they are, but they're just different. And so when you get cases like that, I find that very compelling because obviously the thing about sound is you don't just hear it, you can feel it. And in some cases you can even see it depending on your environment. So I think that's a remarkable aspect, that whatever these situations are, that it's able to tailor itself to the audience and present itself in a way that seems to be more acceptable to its audience.
Exactly. Yeah, people have described it as being very beautiful. And here's a case that's fairly typical. Adams Middle School, Grand Prairie, Texas, October 1982. These objects came over the playground. There was actually a school dance at the time, so this is one of the few evening cases. And everyone was outside after the school dance when these objects appeared. They were multicolored orbs starting around this very large oval object. And they started making geometric patterns and putting on a show like they do. It actually stopped traffic around the school. And some of these were so low that the students could actually feel it. There was a sort of a static electric charge, which caused their clothes to cling to their body, which we do hear in some cases.
Yeah.
And this was seen by all the school officials. And it turned out one of the witnesses who actually made this report later as an adult, she became a military intelligence officer. So pretty intelligent witness.
Yeah.
And she was a school volunteer. She worked in the school office. So the next day, military officials showed up, Air Force officers, and were questioning the school officials about this incident. And they left, and following that, the principal made an announcement over the loudspeakers to the entire school, because this was causing quite a buzz at the school, and everyone was talking about the UFOs. And he says, no, this was not UFOs. This was a light show put on by people. And this really upset the student, who, eventually made a report to the UFO reporting centers. So she decided to conduct an investigation. This is kind of the incident that turned her into an intelligence officer for the military.
Yeah.
Because she's like, all right, this is one of the first investigations she did. And she started calling up all the laser people, anyone who could possibly put on any light show anywhere in the area. And nobody did. There was no possible culprit for this. So it's just really interesting. It's another case where they try to cover this up. It's such a shame.
Yeah.
I mean, what? Very, very interesting.
Yeah.
But,
and it just shows you, even in modern cases, Preston, they will try and create an explanation. And I'm often surprised, but I think when we look back, as I think we've touched on during our conversation, these days people are more sceptical about official explanations for a variety of things. And I think sometimes when we look back at cases from the 50s and 60s that are explained away as balloons, planes, helicopters, Venus, swamp gas, whatever, and we laugh at how people just went, oh, well, that must be what it is. And I think when you have a witness like this that's clearly experienced something and they hear the official explanation, for them to go, no, I'm not buying that, I'm not having that at all, that doesn't match with what I saw or what I experienced, I think fair play to them, because I think now people have got more opportunity to do their own investigation, to verify this official explanation and come back with it and go, no, that's not what happened here.
Yeah. And there are modern cases, by the way. I mean, the Ariel School occurred in 1994, which is not that long ago.
Yeah.
There was another one in Sri Lanka, April 30th, 1998, at Adakiram Primary School, where there had been waves of sighting over the school so often that the kids nicknamed these UFOs Koka, which means stork.
Yeah.
And it was flying over the school. And one morning, there was 3 students who were just opening the school. These were honor students who were all lined up for scholarships and trusted with the keys to the school. I mean, really good students. And this object landed on the playground right next to them, and it left landing imprints on the school grounds there, which they took photographs of.
Yeah,
this is great physical evidence. And there's another very recent case, April 2nd, 2018, where a UFO was seen over West Nusa School on Tenggara Island in Indonesia. Again, showing how worldwide this is. And this was at high noon, and it was a bright, bright object, very low. Teachers saw it as well. She pulls out her cell phone and takes a picture of it. And the picture showed only whiteness because it was so bright. It was just a white screen that came out on her camera. So it was, not a great picture.
Yeah.
Few people have managed to capture photographs. There was a case in Moline, Illinois, where there was a police officer on the playground when a UFO showed up. All the nuns, this is a religious school, nuns were looking at it, all the students. It was a big, like, floating school bus type object is how they described it. And he ran into his police cruiser and grabbed his movie camera and actually managed to take almost a minute of footage. And boy, did this cause an uproar. He was visited by government officials and men in black who refused to identify themselves and wanted to see the footage. It was changed his life for sure. It freaked him out that, the government was so interested in this. But yeah, it was filmed again at Hotchkiss High School, where this UFO appeared, and over a period of days, it kept appearing. Finally, one of the students took a camera and waited for it along with a group of teachers and students. And sure enough, this object showed up and posed for them and actually appeared and disappeared as he was doing sort of a time-lapse photography with it. And you can see it on this photo where there's a stream of light and then it ends and then it reappears. So again, it's as if it knew it was being photographed and came to, show its best side.
Absolutely. As you were saying, Preston, since the book's come out, people have started coming forward and giving you their experiences. Have any of the new cases surprised you in what's been reported, or once again, are you seeing similar trends and aspects of these cases that mirror what's gone on previously, that since you found that case back in 1950 over at Prestonburg in Kentucky, that there is this kind of performance aspect to it, there is this kind of acceptance by the witnesses as to what they're seeing, or is there a differential to these newer reports that you've got coming forward to you?
No, they follow the same pattern for sure. I think some of the cases do show that there are deeper aspects to some of these cases, and they're not just sightings. But I collected 100 cases. That's a lot.
Yeah.
And when you have 100 cases, that's a database you can do some thoroughly accurate statistical analysis of. And these cases do follow a very set pattern. As I said, they show up around recess or lunch. It's usually, high noon, 11 a.m., 3 o'clock in the afternoon, on a bright sunny day. 30% they're landing. It's usually right next to the playground, often within a grove of trees. These are very low level, very long lasting. It's the same pattern over and over again. Kids are not frightened in the vast majority of these cases. They're very open-minded. They're jumping up and down. They're excited. Mm-hmm. It's clearly unusual. They can tell this is not a normal event, but they aren't scared. It's the teachers who are scared. Got a new case in Australia, same thing. The kids are like, wow, look, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And the teachers come running out and freak out and start gathering all the kids and pulling them inside. So that's the pattern I see. But yeah, some of these newer cases, I'm like, wow, these ETs are actually appearing in the school itself.
Oh.
Or some of these missing time cases are fascinating. There was one case, which is in the book, where there was missing time at a school where everyone was on the playground. And one of the students is a very good student. When the bell rang, he was always first in line to get back into the school.
Yeah.
Well, suddenly everyone's in front of the school ready to get in, and he comes running up, and they all look at him like he popped out of the air or something. And he couldn't understand what had happened because he had been looking at this sort of rainbow object with these other students. And it was that evening he had this dream in which he was actually taken on board. And it turns out some of the other students had this dream as well, I believe. And in his dream, he remembered seeing other students, and they were all being given these sort of tests using telekinesis and trying to move objects with their mind.
Yeah.
And mental tests of various types. And I think this is an indication, that this was probably more than just a sighting. And I'm guessing that's probably occurs more than is evident in some of these cases, because missing time can be very seamless, and kids might not even recognize it. But certainly there are a lot of these cases. I think the 100 that as I mentioned earlier, is the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
I'm guessing there's thousands. And I know that sounds crazy, but the vast majority of these cases, the testimony is resting on just a few witnesses. The Rua Zimbabwe case is unique in that there are some 50 students who have testified to this.
Yeah.
Same with Westall or the Broadhaven. The cases that have gotten really famous often have multiple witnesses, but a number of these come out years later and resting on the testimony of one or two students who were there, and none of the other students talked about it. Makes you wonder, because some of these cases, people will have this experience and it's just not talked about the next day at all, or not even remembered. There was one case in France at Vendôme boarding school where Lady and her husband were just, this is years later after the incident, he mentioned UFOs, and suddenly she remembered seeing this object. It had gone from her memory for most of her life.
Yeah.
This was a very low-level sighting, which caused panic. People were running around screaming, and she could not believe she had forgotten this. There's a weird amnesia aspect to many of these encounters, and that usually indicates something more than just a sighting, deeper levels of contact.
It is remarkable, and I think, as with anything, when you find a topic like this that's as deeply fascinating as you have in your Schoolyard UFO book, Preston, which is a fantastic collection, I must admit I was stunned of how many there actually are. So I think only by bringing these experiences and witnesses out into reality and for everybody to find out about them, I think, as you say, it clearly is the tip of the iceberg. Because if you think of how many schools there are around the world and how long this has been going on, as you say, you found one case from the 19th century, but obviously from 1950 onwards there seems to be quite a lot. And I think the more you dig into something like this, the more you're going to uncover. And I can't wait to see what you come up with next, because clearly this is only going to bring more cases forward that we've probably never even heard of.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's going to happen again. It's consistent enough. I mean, I found high quality cases pretty much multiple every year from 1950 onwards. And so I'm sure, absolutely 100% sure, this will happen again. I scoured the literature looking for other cases that were all similar. And I did find another sort of category of UFO cases that are strikingly similar. And I first looked at sporting events and I'm like, And I found that soccer case that you mentioned with the angel hair.
Yeah.
And a few others. And I'm like, well, no, I've only found a few. I looked at sporting events because I thought, well, people are outside. There's a lot of people. This would be a great place for a nice UFO event. Nope. Couldn't find it. But then I did find, and this was so bizarre and really shocking, and I ended up writing a book about it, UFOs at drive-in theaters.
Yeah.
Because I had my own case where a lady at my office where I work had a UFO hover Paramount Drive-In here in Southern California. Very low level, actually so low level, it was next to the movie screen, and it cleared out the theater. This is an outdoor theater. And everyone saw it. This was well over 200 people saw this. And there are other witnesses that she heard from. I thought, wow, I thought it was a one-off, a unique case. But then I was writing a book, UFOs over Colorado, and I ran into 3 cases in Colorado alone. So I decided to this sounds like the Schoolyard encounters.
Yeah.
And I dug deep, and I found, again, over 100 cases. And the pattern is the same with the Schoolyard encounters. Very low level, long lasting, putting on a display, smaller objects come out of the larger ones, they'll flash their lights, it circles the theater, hundreds of witnesses, this time adults. The only real difference is it's at night, but it's so close that there's no chance of misperception. And boy, that was so shocking to me because I didn't find hardly any of these cases in my vast library of books. I had to dig deep into newspaper, mostly is where I found them. Same pattern.
Do you think this is because of the people involved or the situation? Like you say, we've got children mostly with the Schoolyard encounters and drive-in theatres. So teenagers and young adults, Preston. Do you think often that people dismiss these cases or just don't take them seriously because of the age of the people involved?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, many of these Schoolyard cases got almost zero investigation, even when well publicized. There was a great case involving a number of students, and it was investigated by Gale and Hynek and some other well-known researchers who were arguing amongst each other about the legitimacy of a child witness. And one was absolutely convinced that they were all convinced the children were telling the truth.
Yeah.
But they were questioning their ability to perceive or interpret what they saw. And one of the investigators was absolutely certain the children were describing only what they saw, not overlaying any interpretation. Or others were like, well, children might exaggerate. But they actually called the police, and the investigators spoke to the police officer who was the first to actually speak with the witnesses. And the police officer said, oh, no, these kids saw exactly what they described, because when he talked to them, they were very emotional, tearful even. And they had to run home and showed it off to their older brother. So there were older students who saw it as well. I think students, I looked into this, and if you actually, and I've interviewed little children as well, and adults who had their encounters as little children. And children make excellent witnesses. They are really able to describe things in great detail because of their ability to absorb knowledge. And it's such an impressive event that it sticks with them. Whereas adults, will say, oh, I don't know if this was, they start going through all the possible things it could be. Instead of I'm like, just tell me what you saw. But I think it was a demon. I'm like, well, no, just describe to me what you actually saw. Don't tell me what you think it was. Because this is an absolute problem. People look through events in their life through the lens of their belief system.
Yeah.
And through a lens of fear as well. If someone is afraid, and I see this fairly often, it makes them poor observers. I had one gentleman, this was a multiple witness case where a UFO was hovering over a person's house very low, sent down a beam of light, and there were teenage witnesses. And one of the teenage witnesses was fascinated. He wanted to run into the beam of light. He gave an excellent interview, very detailed. And the other kid, I'm trying to get a description from him, and he was not able to give it one. And I'm kind of just questioning him. He says, honestly, Preston, I'm sorry. I can't really tell you. I was too scared to look at it. And I hid behind the house, against the wall of the house, and I didn't want to look at it. I was too scared. So fear is a barrier to good perception.
It is. And like you say, if anything, children are less likely to be corrupted by mainstream media or knowledge. They would just simply say what they saw, whereas I think the older people they may understand or they may have read more about the subject, Preston, and therefore, as you refer to there, they try to explain what they think they've seen rather than what they actually saw.
Yeah, and kids, parents know this. You can kind of tell when your young child is lying. They have very obvious tells. Their voice will raise, or they'll kind of look you in the eye. Or their story changes. You know what I mean? They get emotional.
Yeah.
But it's very clear to parents when their children are lying.
Yeah.
And the children of these witnesses are also very much impressed that their kids are telling the truth.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's an absolutely fascinating topic, Preston. I could go through all 100 cases in your book because there are some remarkable encounters, remarkable witnesses, terrified teachers, very matter-of-fact explanations from the children and the witnesses that you've interviewed. Where can everybody keep up to date with your work, get hold of a copy of this brilliant book, and see what you're up to next, my friend?
Hey, thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, I do have a website. I think if you just punch my name into a search engine on the internet, it'll take you there. But the actual address is prestondennett.weebly.com. So all my books are there in excerpts. You can also contact me if you have a comment or a question or a story you'd like to share. I always love hearing from people. My books are on Amazon and other online retailers. I'm on Facebook and Twitter and social media. I have a YouTube channel for people who don't have time to read books. I'm putting out my research on this YouTube channel. So I'm having a lot of fun with that. I feel like this is an important subject. People, you might be skeptical of it, which I understand. I was a skeptic. Or you might not think, this doesn't affect me. Why should I care? This is a very important subject. I mean, if we actually have this technology, this has the potential to change everything.
Yeah.
We don't have to work to survive if we have free energy. There's really enough resources for everybody. This could solve our energy crisis, our economic crisis, our environmental crisis, all of which are largely manufactured by our own ignorance and stupidity and greed and corruption.
Yep.
And I think that this could really turn around society in a big way if we just accepted the fact that we have other people out there. And it's so obvious we do. You just have to go outside at night and look at the stars to know that we're not alone.
Yeah.
And if you look at the evidence, it's absolutely overwhelming. It's 100% conclusive. It's not just eyewitness testimony. It's not just photographs and moving films. There are landing traces. There are metal fragments. There are medical effects, healings. We didn't even get into the healing cases, or injury cases, or implant removals, I could go on and on. There is physical, conclusive evidence for this. UFOs are real, and it's time everyone stopped calling it a mystery. Because it's not. We know what this is. It's aliens. They're here. And it's time everyone accepts that.
Fabulous. Preston, it's been an absolute pleasure to finally speak to you, and I'm sure we will speak again in the future. You are always welcome to return to Mysteries and Monsters, and I wish you all the very best, and have a wonderful Christmas.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. And yeah, happy holidays.